Okay, chapter 9 of Golden Ditches. It's called Beaver Pelt Passage. Do you guys remember the beaver trade was such a big deal in the opening of the West? Remember that? All right, there we go. If you look at a map showing the tremendous area covered by the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, you will readily understand what one of Cartier's Indian guides meant when he said, "No man has ever paddled all the way to the end of the waters." Although it had taken Cartier nearly 6 full weeks to sail up the St. Lawrence, only as far as the present site of Montreal, he still could not believe that the river and lakes continued on for such a vast distance. On the other hand, he told himself, if the waters really do stretch as far as they say, I may have found the route to the Southern Sea after all. Others who came after Cartier followed a somewhat similar line of reasoning. Nearly 100 years later, Champlain sent a man named Etienne Brulé to bring back the facts. Brulé did not find a northwest passage, but he returned to Quebec filled with wondrous tales. He told of finding a huge lake that was like an ocean itself. He could never have guessed that he had chanced upon Lake Superior, the biggest freshwater lake in the world. In order to reach this mighty inland sea, he had to carry his canoes around a spot where the icy waters leaped and foamed through the rapids of the St. Mary's River. No doubt he was the first of many who saw the need for a canal to bypass this boulder-strewn cataract. An old French word for leap is sault, but whether Brulé or some later French voyager so named this place, we do not know. In any event, Etienne Brulé became the first known white man to look upon the Sault, a place where history had been hammered out for 1,000 years before America was even discovered. Here, the moccasined feet of the Algonquins, Hurons, and Chippewas had worn smooth paths along the river. Sometimes they had come on stealthy souls in full war paint, but more often their mission had been the peaceful pursuit of game and fish. Brulé's tales aroused the curiosity of others who wanted to see for themselves the meeting place of the great waters. A fur trader named Jean Nicolet arrived first and was followed a few years later by Jesuit priests. Before long, the other fur traders drifted in on the still faint trail that led to the Sault. You might pronounce it Sault. I don't know. It's S-A-U-L-T. Then in 1668, Father Jacques Marquette came down from Quebec and founded a mission beside the leaping waters. He called it Sault Ste. Marie. This desolate outpost, farther away even than the moon, as Henry Clay put it nearly a century later, became the first permanent white settlement in what is now the state of Michigan. Why did the good father choose such a bleak, God-forsaken site for his mission? Père Marquette no doubt had good reasons for his choice of locations. Perhaps he already knew that tribes from all over the northern shores of the Great Lakes came there every summer to feast on the millions of trout and whitefish that at times darkened the churning waters of St. Mary's Leap. What better place for a Christian mission than right at the very crossroads of the lakes? Marquette saw the Sault not only as a famous crossing, but as a natural gateway to the north and west. Even though the mission seemed ideally located, few converts were made. In early summer, the Indians came as usual, set up their teepees, and gorged themselves on fish exactly as they had been doing for centuries. They listened politely while the holy men told them stories of Abraham and Moses and of the one and only Great White Father. Afterward, they drifted back to their campsites and practiced the ancient pagan rites that had been handed down from their ancestors. When the spawning run ended, they made a final offering to their own god, Kitchi Manitou, and slipped away into the deep and silent forests. Still, their brief contact with the white man brought about a drastic change in their way of life. When they found that they could trade animal skins for such wonderful things as steel fishing spears and hooks, the Indians took to the woods with a new purpose. What did it matter if the price of an iron cooking pot was 100 muskrat skins, or if 1,000 ermine pelts were needed to buy a musket? Every lake, stream, and swamp fairly teemed with mink, marten, fishers, and beaver, just waiting to be snared. Very soon the Indians were joined by some of the most colorful adventurers that ever paddled across the pages of history, a group of rough and ready Frenchmen who called themselves coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, found their way to the Sault and drove down on into the wild country beyond. Tough, hard-muscled men, carefree and full of a joyous spirit of adventure, they pushed farther and farther into the virgin wilderness. Alone or in pairs, they buried themselves for months on end in remote forests where no white man had ever set foot. Their fringed buckskin shirts and ever-present tobacco pouches marked them as a breed apart. They made fast friends among the Chippewas and Iroquois. Some of them married Indian maidens and lived with the red men as brothers. They learned to make fine birch-bark canoes and used their ingenuity and better tools to improve the light, rawhide snowshoes that the Indians had devised to walk on top of the deep drifts. Although they were mainly traders, many of them could not resist the urge to get into the game themselves. Armed with steel traps and muskets, the coureurs de bois often outdid the Indians in gathering pelts. It seemed that no matter how many bales of furs were shipped to the hungry markets down east or across the sea to Europe, more were always urgently needed. Beaver pelts became the king of the fur bearers when every man who could possibly afford one insisted on a broad-brimmed beaver hat. Women of fashion added their ever-mounting demands to the growing list. No lady considered herself decently dressed unless her garments were adorned with mink, ermine, or marten. The fur trade boomed, and the voyageurs sang their lusty songs and paddled merrily along the seemingly endless shores of the Great Lakes. At first, when the coureurs de bois returned to the Sault with their winter catch, they shouldered their fragile canoes and followed the ancient Indian trails around the rapids. Then they took to the water again and headed for the markets down lake. But as the trade grew, so did the length and the weight of the canoes. Soon giant craft measuring as long as 45 feet swept down from Lake Superior hard behind the retreating ice. Above the Sault, the traders beached their fur-laden boats and carried the heavy bales downstream to calmer waters. Even men accustomed to all kinds of hardships found this portage a time-consuming nuisance. To keep the fur flowing and the voyageurs singing, the Northwest Fur Company in 1798 dug a canal to bypass the rapids on the Canadian side of the river. Can't you just hear the joyous whoops of the coureurs de bois when their long canoes glided down the channel into the loch and dropped without the slightest splash to the new level? When the Indians returned to the land of Hiawatha and told their tribesmen about the white man's sit-down portage, red men by the hundreds came to see this wonder for themselves. They were not too impressed when the canoe was lowered, but when rose up in the loch, as if lifted by some giant unseen hand, they stared in amazement. Then and there the Indians must have concluded that the white man possessed powerful magic indeed. Less than 20 years after the sit-down portage opened, the fur trade ceased to be a big business. Michigan's economy made a forced switch to an agricultural one. From then until statehood was achieved in 1837, farming became the main industry. Instead of the booming songs of the coureurs de bois, only the sound of rushing water disturbed the silent slumber of St. Mary's Leap. But fate stepped in again. Rich deposits of iron and copper ores were discovered in the Upper Peninsula. A wave of mineral seekers poured in and began to tunnel the mountains and carve huge craters in the rocky landscape. Even before the mines and quarries reached full production, another industry gradually inched its way toward the upper lakes. The demand for lumber and forest products brought a new breed of warriors to Michigan's forests. Buckskin shirts gave way to plaid mackinaws as the sturdy woodsmen slashed away at the forests that had been home to the trappers of the previous century. The Great Lakes once more became the high road of commerce. Sault Ste. Marie stood squarely in the center of the feverish activity. But its tiny canal now faced a grave problem, one that swelled mightily with the number and size of ships plying the lakes. Now, as never before, the white man's magic faced a trying test. His boat box had been able to handle the largest birch bark canoes, even when they groaned beneath the weight of many heavy bales of fur. But at the sight of a boat loaded to the gunwales with iron ore, the canalmen shuddered. "They've taken to hauling rocks," they said, and shook their heads ominously. Their fears were well-founded, for the shallow ditch with its single lock could not begin to handle the fast-growing traffic. St. Mary's Leap needed a new lift. When Stevens T. Mason became the first governor of Michigan, he began an immediate campaign for a ship canal at the Sault. He hammered away constantly at the many national benefits such a canal would bring, but a long and lonely stretch of wilderness separated the Sault from Washington, D.C. It was during one of the many bitter debates on the proposed canal that Henry Clay made the remark that the Sault was further away than the moon. At last, in disgust at the short-sightedness of the federal government, Mason decided that Michigan would tackle the job on its own. His attempt scarcely got off the ground when it was found that the canal route led right through the military reservation at Fort Brady. Permission to dig was flatly refused by the United States Army, and the canal existed only as a paper ditch for the next 13 years. That meant it was only on maps, only on paper. They didn't get it dug in real life. Then, stop lurking over my shoulder. Then Congress, prodded on by no less than a personage than President Millard Fillmore himself, finally gave the go-ahead. If you are fond of the kind of tales that chill your blood on a midsummer's day, try reliving the story of the Soltz building. In contrast to the slithering sands that plagued the hot and dry Suez or the steaming swamps of the Panamanian jungle, the Soltz passed through a land of savage cold. In a letter to a friend, one workman said, "Regarding your question about the weather here, I would say it varies. Most of the time it is awfully cold, but occasionally it gets even colder than that." When the work crew was at full strength, which was very seldom, around 2,000 men hammered away at earth so firmly frozen that it differed little from the living rock. Frostbitten fingers, faces, and feet ranked among the hazards of working in temperatures that range from 0 downward to 35 below. But the cold did not keep disease away from the diggings. Both typhoid fever and cholera reached epidemic proportions. Deaths reached such a frightening level that bodies were buried secretly at night to keep the healthy workers from learning the full extent of the fatalities. Although this ruse helped, a great many laborers abandoned the project anyhow. But like most other great canals in history, the Soldt had a man behind it who recognized no such word as failure. Its hero was a young salesman from Vermont named Charles Harvey. As superintendent of construction, Harvey provided the kind of inspiration and tireless leadership that blasted to completion the busiest ditch in the world. In the process, he earned a place for himself beside such diggers as Darius, de Lesseps, and Goethals. His living monument at the Soldt would live as long as men and ships sail the seas. There is little time or place for romance in the some 700 sleek freighters that shuttle through the five giant locks of the modern Soldt Canal. All is strictly business as they glide in like fat ducks from the cold blue-black waters of Lake Superior and make the 21-foot leap downward to Lake Huron. The sharp eyes of the runners of the woods have been replaced by ghostly radar screens, and deep-throated foghorns growl and grumble where once rang the lusty songs of the voyageurs. No more are the Algonquins and the Ojibways seen at St. Mary's Leap. In their places, tourists from all over the world gather to gawk at the parade of ships that in only 8 months tote more tonnage than is handled by all of the United States ports on the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico combined. One of those tourists, watching ships lining up like shoppers at a checkout station in a busy supermarket, shook her head as if to clear her eyes and said, "It's unbelievable." "That's what it is. Just unbelievable." Etienne Brulé and Père Marquette would quite probably nod their heads in agreement.